Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this afternoon's webinar. My name is Dallas Nevins, and I'm happy to be hosting this exciting topic with our presenter, Dr. Jody Bradham. Today we are going to be talking about a schoolyard approach to building employee ownership. And just a few housekeeping items before we start. All of the phone lines have been muted due to the large number of registrants, but we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and Jody will address as many as he can at the end of the presentation. And should we not get to your questions, and if you should have additional questions, please feel free to email us at info@talentquest.com. And I will turn it over to Jody now. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Dallas, for the introduction. And again, welcome to everybody, and thanks for taking time out of your busy day to be with me. Well, listen, with school starting back over these past few weeks, I've been finding myself thinking more and more about our children. You know, we send our kids off to school in order that they can learn from adults all the things they need to know in order to be successful in life. But the funny thing is, though, that kids can teach us as much as we teach them. It's amazing to think about all the things that kids teach us that as we get older and supposedly wiser, we simply forget or minimize as being irrelevant to our current realities. You know, for example, things like creativity, imagination, or really just the ability to have fun in whatever environment you're in. These are all examples of things that we learn as youngsters, but for whatever reason we seem to forget those as we get older. Well, I think it's kind of unfortunate that we forget so many things that kids teach us, and so in the spirit of remembering, I wanted to spend a few minutes slowing down and actually taking a closer look. As the saying goes, in order to notice, we must first look. And so that's what I want to do with you guys today. Specifically, I wanted to take a look at what children, young children, between the ages of 4 and 6 in particular, can teach those of us in leadership positions about building strong engagement and even ownership mindsets in our teams and in our organizations. But before I get too far ahead of myself, I want to step into the conference room here before we go into the world of the child so we can lay out our expectations and the plan for the day. So real quick, here's kind of how we're going to spend our hour together. I'll do a quick lay of the land as it relates to the current state of affairs in the American workforce in regards to engagement. We'll look at a very quick working definition of engagement. And then we'll talk briefly about the difference between ownership and engagement. What is the real difference between those two things? And from there, we'll go straight to our learning from the children and try to link that back to our application in our grown-up world. And in the spirit of school, there'll be some questions for you along the way. And as Dallas mentioned, I'm looking forward to fielding any questions you may have as well. So with the agenda laid out, let's take a quick look at who our teachers for today are going to be. So first we have Harvard Business School professor and speaker and author, Teresa Amabile. Next we have a speaker and author and professor as well, Daniel Pink. But then we have folks today like B.F. Skinner, one of the first psychologists who really helped us to understand what influenced behavior in others. Then comes Abraham Maslow. You're all familiar with his hierarchy of needs, but he was one of the first psychologists that really helped us to understand that A, we all have needs, and B, we're always working to try to get those needs met. And finally, this fella is Julian Rotter. One of his biggest areas of research revolved around what he called expectancy theory, from which the whole locus of control concept was born. But ultimately, all of these folks have simply put into words the lessons taught to us by the real teachers for the day, our children. So today we're going to let the kids teach us, and we're going to rely on those grown-ups I just mentioned to help us understand what we're seeing from them. So let's jump in and start off with a few statistics for your review. And these statistics are really up here simply to help underscore how relevant and significant this issue is for today's workforce. You know, beginning with the most recent research published earlier this year by Gallup, the engagement experts out there, their research found that 70% of American workers are not engaged or are actively disengaged from their work. And this is followed by research from McKinsey & Company put out last year that said these demotivated and actively disengaged employees are costing the economy up to $355 billion in lost productivity each year. And what's interesting about that research is it's actually about $100 billion lower than Gallup's estimate of those costs. So from these two reports alone, we see that a disengaged American workforce is a significant issue for most companies. And this issue comes at a significant cost to both the organization and the economy as a whole. But let's take it a step further and look at these last two bullets. Research from PricewaterhouseCoopers published last year found that as unemployment has decreased, voluntary turnover has increased. And this is particularly true among what they called high performers over the past 2 years consecutively. Now, what's interesting about that is it really speaks to another impact of having a disengaged workforce. Folks will simply bide their time until what they perceive to be a better opportunity presents itself. And when it does, they're very much at risk for walking out the door. So hopefully this sets just a very quick context for how important the issue of engagement is. But before we go further to see what we can do about that, let's make sure we have a good understanding of what we mean by engagement. And so in the spirit of the school spirit, here's your first poll question. So look at the definitions before you and take a minute to reflect on them and pick which of these definitions do you think accurately reflects engagement. All right, well, let's see what we came up with. Looks like there was some back and forth on some of these decisions. But it looks like the majority of you went with option C, the extent to which employees believe in what they do, feel valued for it, and are willing to spend their intellectual effort to make the organization successful. Well, congratulations to you guys that chose option C, but the truth is that was somewhat of a trick question because really all of these definitions are representative of what we mean by the term engagement. And so for the purposes of today's conversation, though, I'm going to parse all these down into one simple definition, that being engagement is moving from an attitude of what can I get to what can I give. Now, if we take that definition of engagement and differentiate it a little bit from ownership, here's what I mean by that. Organizations, in my opinion, are responsible for building engagement in their employees, but it's really the managers and more individual relationships that help to build ownership among employees. Building a culture of ownership, it's about creating an environment where intrinsic motivation can thrive. For those of you that are up on the research in this, you'll notice you're starting to see more commentary about building motivational systems into employment engagement programs. Those motivational systems are talking about ways to build ownership, an ownership mindset. It's building a culture of owners. Building a culture of owners focuses on building an internal push versus an external pull for maximizing personal contribution and impact. Those are psychological terms, push and pull, but essentially we're trying to tap into an individual's internal resources to not only compel them to act, but to compel them to act in a way that adds value to them and the organization and drives the organization forward as if they really were partial owner in the organization. So simply put, ownership is taking engagement one step further. It's leveraging internal motivation to take independent action in a way that results in added value to the person and the organization. Or as I like to say, it's engagement supersized. And so it is this ownership piece that we're going to look to the kids to help us figure out how we can create. And so now that we've got the context of the rest of the day, let's travel into a more natural world of a 5-year-old to see what they can teach us about creating an environment where intrinsic motivation can flourish. And so when we watch kids, these young kids in particular, in their natural space, there's really three things that we can take away from our observations that can help us create environments that raise internal motivation. Those three things are power, progress, and purpose. Those are pretty big ideas for such young children, of course. So let's take a closer look to see what we really mean by those. So first, let's take a look at power. Okay? Now, what I mean by the word power is not that kids want to control everything or everybody. Rather, what I mean by power is, in this context, is simply having the power to act on the ideas they have in the ways that allow them to achieve the outcomes they desire to achieve. Basically, it's about wanting to play by their own rules in regards to the activities they choose to engage in. Take, for example, a group of kids on the playground during school, much like the picture you see on the screen there. If left alone, these kids will soon make up a game, and they'll begin playing and getting fully involved in this game. Now imagine that teacher that's standing to the side there, perhaps out of concern for safety or whatever, starts to put a bunch of parameters or restrictions or even brings rules into the game. Here comes question number 2 for you. As adults begin putting more rules around the games children play, as in this example, what do you think the reaction of these children will be? Take a minute and pick one of these options here. All right, very good. That seems to be a no-brainer question, which I was kind of hoping it would be. Absolutely right. Nobody's going to be thanking the adults for making the game so much more fun. And while you may have a few kids who ignore the teachers and the adults on a temporary basis, very quickly they're going to quit playing the game. It's funny. Young kids, they have a sense in their own mind for what they think will be fun for them, and that's what they want to act on. And when adults start injecting their views into this, kids very quickly realize that their views just don't count anymore, and therefore they start to disengage from the activity. So let's go back to the conference room and let's see if we can make the link from the schoolyard back to our workplace. Professional adults in this regard are very similar to young children in that we all have thoughts or ideas about what would work best or what would produce the best outcomes, and we want to be able to act on these ideas. Think about it in your spaces for a minute. Who doesn't have at least one person who says things like, gosh, if only I were in charge, I would do this, or if I were in charge, I would do that. The problem is that instead of encouraging them to own those ideas and therefore act like owners within the organization, cultures too often stifle this independence. Over time, as with the kids playing the game on the playground, when adults do not feel like they have the power to execute their jobs in the way they feel to be most beneficial, they too are going to start to disengage. At this point, instead of building intrinsic motivation, we've really created a dependency on extrinsic motivation. This is the old carrot and stick method of motivating people. Now, while this can be an effective method of getting compliance from employees, it will not be an effective method for gaining commitment from those employees, especially over the long haul, especially when we're asking them to go above and beyond, quote unquote, their call of duty, period. So what are some things we can do to help create a greater sense of power in our people? Well, first, we want to set clear expectations for outcomes and deliverables for which they're going to be held accountable. And we want to do this early in the process rather than doing it kind of along the way. The more you start to talk about expectations and outcomes along the way, the more quickly it begins to feel like that teacher putting parameters and restrictions while we're in the middle of playing the game. It very quickly can be perceived as stifling and as invalidating of the employee's individual power. Secondly, we want to establish clear guardrails, but we want to keep those guardrails far apart. We can't just give employees free rein to do whatever it is they want to do, but we really do want to be able to give them as much leeway as possible so that they can act on the ideas that they bring. It's in the distance between these guardrails where these employees are going to be allowed to actually act on their ideas, and in so doing, there's opportunity for the organization to really see the benefits of creativity and innovation that gets expressed in those lanes. And that leads to the third point. We really want to support innovation and creativity when it happens. So many times organizations get locked into, this is kind of how we've always done things, or that's not the way we do things around here. And the more that culture embeds itself, the more the message is being sent, hey, you may have great ideas that could contribute, but we really aren't interested in them, so just get with the program and move forward. And that very quickly will stifle, obviously, any creativity and innovation, but very quickly it will cause employees to disengage as well. So look at those guardrails and think about it as guardrails on the highway, right? We don't want to keep folks locked into one lane. Let's give them a pretty wide set of lanes to ride in, making sure that the guardrails are up so that nobody goes off the edge of the cliff unnecessarily. But then the next point there is you want to monitor against being too closely attached to your projects. This is particularly true for you managers and those that are directly leading people out there. Rather than being attached to your projects, you really want to be attached to your people. If you develop your people, then the projects will take care of themselves. On the other hand, if you're focused too closely on the projects, it's going to be difficult for you to step back and to let go of some of the control, which means it's going to be difficult for you to let anybody else inject their version of what needs to happen into the project. Which leads to the next bullet there. This is going to be somewhat of an iterative process, and so you've got to allow for mistakes to be made. But again, if we're clear on the expectations and the outcomes and the deliverables, and we've got firm guardrails in place, then any mistakes that are going to be made should be relatively minor within the big context, and will all be used to help facilitate further innovation and development of our employees. And last but not least, we want to simply get out of the way. Sometimes managers and leaders can be a little too closely, can monitor and manage a little too closely for their own good. So when you've got all the parameters in place, it's at that point where you want to just step to the side and get out of the way, but stay within reach. And that's what I mean by remain available. Stay close enough so that you can be a resource for the employee when needed. Otherwise, hand it over and let them go. Now let's head back to the classroom here and see the second thing that kids can teach us about building an ownership culture. And that second thing really is this: it's progress. Be it in school or at play, children have a natural need to recognize that they're making progress when they're engaged in activities that are important to them. Think about, for example, a child and a puzzle. If you give a young child a puzzle that's too easy for them, perhaps it's way below their developmental level, if they play with it at all, they'll do so without much enthusiasm, they'll complete it quickly, and then they'll soon be looking for something more interesting to do. Likewise, if you give a child a puzzle that's far above his or her level, such that he has difficulty making any progress or finding the right pieces to put together, he again will rather quickly become frustrated and disinterested, and he'll soon move on to a different task. Now, if we use the Goldilocks principle, if you give a young child a puzzle that's challenging for them, but not so challenging that they can't begin to see progress, this child's going to remain engaged in the task for a much longer amount of time. In fact, as the pieces of the puzzle start to come together and the kids can actually see what the picture is they're trying to build, they're more likely to invest in the activity and more likely to see it through to completion. And in fact, the other picture you see on the screen there, the video game industry has really capitalized on this concept. For those of you that are familiar with the gaming world out there, you'll recognize that just about all of the games, the video games these days, are level-based games, meaning the objective in the game is to progress from one level to the next. And while playing these games, you're always aware of the progress you're making in any one level. The video game industry has realized that folks really need to understand that they're making progress in the activities they choose to engage in. If they don't feel like they're making progress, be it because the activities are simply not challenging enough, or the other, if there's just too many obstacles or they're too challenging, folks are going to disengage very quickly. And so going back into the conference room, we can see again that young kids and professional adults are a lot alike in this aspect as well. We're willing to take on challenging tasks. In fact, we prefer challenging tasks to easy ones. But we too have to feel like we're making some kind of progress in order to stay engaged at a high level over an extended period of time. We see this need for progress in a lot of our day-to-day activities. Think, for example, the scale we stand on when we're trying to track our diet, or the bank statements that we go through on a monthly basis to see if and when we'll be able to retire the way we'd like to. But another kind of interesting example of this is the other graphic you see on the screen there. This is called a splash screen. And its only function is to communicate to you, hey, progress is happening, just sit tight and be patient. It serves no technical function on the computer, but it serves a tremendous psychological function for our need to understand progress is being made. And so, that being said, in order to build that ownership culture, we really want to help folks be able to see, have opportunity to make progress and to be able to see when that progress is occurring. So here are some ways that we can do that. Again, we want to set clearly defined performance and developmental goals with highly transparent ways for tracking those goals. So earlier I said we really want to understand what are the objectives and the deliverables that we're shooting for, but what are some of the goals that we need to accomplish in order to get there? That's what I'm referring to here, both from a performance standpoint, but also from a developmental standpoint. How can we help our employees continue to grow in their efforts to meet deliverables and objectives? And we want to do this in a way that's highly transparent, which makes it easy for tracking those goals. And just as an example, this is a screenshot from the goals module from the TalentQuest performance management software system. And you can see how transparent and straightforward this is. The employee can see quickly what their goals are, how much progress they're making or not making towards those goals, and you can even see how much weight each goal carries in their overall performance objectives. So again, just making sure we're very clear in what these goals are, and we're also very transparent in how we're going to monitor and track those goals. The second bullet here says to invite the employee to contribute. Another way that we can help create an environment where progress will be recognized is to help folks begin to pay attention to the need to look for progress. And that's the reason for involving the employee in this. It can be something as simple as this. Look, when we get together again in 6 months for your mid-year review, how will you know that you've made progress? What will tell you that you've grown from where you are today? A simple question like that does a couple things. One is it gets the conversation above table and in clear sunshine that we really want to be tracking progress in everything we do. But more importantly, it gets the employee focused on his or her own ideas for monitoring and measuring progress. When he or she can be challenged to concretely think about what they're going to be looking for as progress indicators, then they're more likely to be able to recognize those progress indicators when in fact they occur. So the third bullet there says create opportunities for small wins when possible. That's a pretty straightforward recommendation there, but the goal is to make sure that folks feel like they're moving forward from where they were. And look for progress indicators within the work itself. We can ask folks to do a self-assessment. Do you feel like you've made any progress from where you were last year? But what really resonates with people is when they can look back on the work that they are doing or have done, and they can see a significant change in that work. As an example, when I look back on some of the reports that I've had to prepare over the past couple of years, can I look back and say that I'm able to prepare these reports with as much quality and attention to detail and service to the customer, but with much more efficiency and much less time investment? If I can answer yes to those questions, then that's a clear indication that I'm making progress in my own development. And so when the work itself can be a source of that feedback for you, that's going to be a great opportunity to help folks recognize that they're moving from where they are to where they want to be. And as a manager, as a leader, part of your responsibility is to look to your team and to remove obstacles and barriers to their progress whenever possible. One of the key factors in disengaged employees is employees who don't feel challenged. But the other factor is folks that feel like, in spite of their best efforts, they keep hitting roadblocks and walls, and therefore they're not going anywhere. It's your job as a manager and leader to look for opportunities to remove those obstacles whenever possible. And then finally, deliver more frequent, honest, and impactful feedback on a consistent basis. And before I talk about that, let me go to the next poll question here. Think about your spaces. When you think about your managers and how they give feedback, when they give feedback, take a minute and reflect on them and answer this question. My managers provide specific feedback, mainly during performance reviews, mainly just when mistakes were made, on a frequent and ongoing basis, or D, rarely if ever. Okay, we got a good little mix there. Looks like about 50% of you chose option A, mainly during formal performance reviews, and roughly 30% of you said option C, on a frequent and ongoing basis. Mainly during formal performance reviews is not a surprise. That's what we see and hear quite frequently. Many times managers and leaders say, look, it's not my role to be given feedback all the time. That's what the performance review is for. So we'll do it at 6 months and we'll do it annually, and then we're not doing it again. I can see the argument in that, but unfortunately the data just doesn't support that as being the most effective route for boosting engagement in our employees. Option C, of course, on a frequent and ongoing basis, is really your best option. But believe it or not, option B is still a good option as well. In fact, we know from research done by Blessing and White back in 2011 that employees who work for managers who give primarily negative feedback, meaning all they get is criticism and feedback when they've screwed something up, even those folks are more engaged than employees who have managers that give little to no feedback. So that's a pretty powerful takeaway from a leadership standpoint. And it's simply, the more we can interact with our people and let them know what they're doing well as what they're not doing so well, as well as what they need to do better at. Any feedback at all is a way for folks to get a sense for how they're progressing or not. And when we can provide people information on how they're progressing or not, we're speaking directly to that need that we all have and that need that we've had since we were 4 years old. So take advantage of really one of your easiest resources out there for boosting engagement. That's simply having more conversations with your employees about what they're doing and how they're doing. Now let's go back to the classroom here and see the third thing that youngsters can teach us about building a culture of ownership through meeting some of those intrinsic motivation needs. And for this one, we're actually going to move from the schoolyard into the backyard to observe our teachers in their natural environments at home. The third thing that children teach us about intrinsic motivation is that when we feel like what we're doing is helping someone or something, when we feel like it actually matters to somebody, we're automatically more invested in that activity. Take, for example, the kids in these pictures. One of the kids reminds me of one of my coworkers' daughters who sweeps the back deck of their house with her daddy just because she feels like she's helping him. It's that type of attitude where kids will do things at this age that in a year or two from now we'll have to bribe them to do. They'll do these activities simply because they want to be helpful. I'm sure you all have examples from the kids in your own lives about this, but the point is we really want to be helpful to those that we care about, and when we can engage in activities that we feel like we're contributing we're more invested in that activity automatically. And so if we link this back to our workspaces, we can again see that in this third regard, professionals and young children are very much alike. We too have a need to understand where we fit in, how our efforts from one day to the next matter, and to whom do they matter. You know, as Nietzsche said, he who has a why to work can tolerate almost any how of work. It's amazing what we can tolerate and put up with in our workspaces if we feel like what we're doing matters to someone or something. You know, and this need to feel like we're making a difference somewhere, it's one reason why Americans contributed more than $220 billion to charitable organizations in 2012 alone. In fact, this has long been held as the secret to Apple's success, especially when it comes to recruiting and retaining key talent. It's not in the perks or the benefits they offer, but it's rather in the messaging of having a chance to make a difference in the world where they find their success. You know, the quote you see on the screen here is pulled directly from their job applicant page. You know, whatever your job is here, you'll be part of something big. You know, Apple gets it. When folks have a sense that what they're doing from one day to the next matters and has an impact, they're automatically more invested and more engaged. So how can we help our employees feel a greater sense of purpose in their work? Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So take a second and look at this poll question. What percentage of your employees have a true understanding of how they personally fit into the overall mission of the organization? And what I mean by this is if I were to pull your employees aside and ask them individually, hey, can you tell me how what you do from one day to the next impacts the organization as a whole? How many of them would be able to answer that question? Okay, looks like we've got a fairly even split, somewhere between 25% and 75%. So the reason for asking the question, as I got ahead of myself there, is one of the easiest things you can do to help speak to that need for purpose is to help employees make the connections in their work. You know, from your responses, anywhere from 25 to 75% of your employees would be able to answer the question, how is it that what you do from day to day impacts the organization as a whole? Well, that's a huge range. Those folks that are 75%, those are folks that are probably going to be more committed and more invested in the work that they do because they can see the connection. Those folks on the lower end of that spectrum, especially when times get tough, these are going to be folks that begin to wonder, am I simply another cog in this wheel? Or do my efforts really matter? Or would they even notice? Or if I just kind of slip under the radar, is that really such a big deal? Okay? So one of the first things you need to do, and one of the easiest things you need to do, is to help your people make the connections in what they do on a day-to-day basis with the overall organization, but also even at a smaller level. How does what they do day-to-day impact fellow members of their team? Beyond that, the department as a whole, and then go into the company. And if your company is so mission focused, how do their activities impact the community, if that's relevant for your company? The second bullet there says increase interaction with others throughout the organization. And this again speaks to some psychological principles of reciprocity. When we feel like we're working with people who are invested in us and care about us, we're more likely to invest in and care about them. And in so doing, we're automatically going to be more invested and engaged in the work that we do, even if it means taking the initiative and acting like owners to take on responsibilities that perhaps aren't even ours to begin with. Okay? Now, as a manager and as a leader, it's going to be important for you to be consistent and persistent in modeling your purpose for others to see. It's not unusual. In fact, it would be unusual for an employee to come to a manager and say, you know, Manager Bob or Manager Sue, I'm just not sure what my purpose is in this organization. That's something that folks will wrestle with internally more than they will be likely to express it. But when they can look to their managers and leaders and say, wow, that person seems to have a real sense of purpose, then they're going to be more hopeful that they too can find their purpose, and at least it makes it a more comfortable conversation for the manager to have with the employee after the fact. So as a manager, it's going to be important for you to model this sense of purpose for everyone to see. And the last bullet here is a cultural challenge, or charge, I should say, to all of you, but it starts with each individual manager and leader, and that is to encourage an other-than-self attitude across the organization. When managers can express and demonstrate a willingness to help others to grow and to learn, and a willingness to invest in them, that speaks to employees on a very personal and core level. And in return, a sense of loyalty is established with that employee that in turn speaks to more engagement and more ownership back into the organization. And then they'll spread that from there. That's part of what taking that ownership mindset is all about. We start with disengaged, we move to engage, and then we take that engagement and we run with it and spread it through the rest of the organization. So in summary, we've talked about these three things. As I just mentioned, disengaged. Clearly the research is showing that this is a significant issue for most organizations in the U.S., and it's coming at a pretty significant direct cost, not to mention the indirect cost of increased voluntary turnover. So we really want to work to move folks from being disengaged to engaged, that point at which they've bought into the mission, and as I say, that they're drinking the Kool-Aid. But even beyond that, if we supersize that engagement, we say these are folks that are not only drinking the Kool-Aid, but they're spreading the good news to all who will listen, and this in turn leads to increased value for that individual, but also for the organization. Ultimately, this is what we should all aspire to in our organizations. Obviously, there's a lot of work to get from point A to B, but if we keep shooting for these owners, the least we're going to get is more engaged employees. So the takeaway here from these 5-year-olds, let's leverage those lessons that the 5-year-olds have taught us, and let's look for opportunities to increase power, progress, and purpose in your employees whenever the opportunity arises. And before we kind of close, I want to give due credit to two references here that if you aren't familiar with these books, I highly recommend them for your reading library. Daniel Pink, as I mentioned earlier, he's the author of Drive, and Teresa Amabile is the lead author for The Progress Principle. These are both outstanding resources, and I highly recommend them for any person in a leadership role, but particularly anybody who's in charge of trying to drive a culture in your organization. Great resources, and a lot of their material is referenced in today's presentation. So with that being said, I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and if there are any questions out there that I can answer for you, I would love to take some time to do that.
Okay, so we have a few questions that have come up, and feel free to enter any as Jody is answering these. And I did want to apologize as well. I know that there was a little bit of delay on the screen when some of the slides were changing, but hopefully everything went smoothly. And now I'll open it up for Jody to answer these questions.
All right. So here's a good question right off the bat. Someone says, so are you saying that if we treat our employees like small children, we'll get more out of them? Now, I appreciate that question very much, and that's absolutely not the point I was trying to make today. The point is simply this. The needs that professionals and grown-up employees have today are very much the same needs we had when we were 4 and 5 and 6 years old. If we can tap into the needs of our employees and help them get those needs met on a consistent basis, we by default will have employees who are more fully committed to us, to our organization, and who end up acting like owners. I would never recommend that we treat employees like children, because in fact we're not. We're professional, competent, grown-up adults. But the interesting thing about human nature is that our grown-up needs are very much the same as they were as youngsters. So thanks for that question, and thanks for the opportunity to clarify that point. So another question is, why is it that you say organizations build engagement but managers build ownership? Well, in full candor, there's overlap. Organizations and managers are going to be responsible for building engagement and ownership. But why I put the burden of ownership on managers is because it's really through building that individual relationship with your team and with your employees that you are more effectively going to be able to help the employees get their needs for purpose, power, and progress met. If we do that at an organizational level, we're going to be somewhat hit and miss with that. We can put systems in place that attempt to speak to that, but it's really the manager and the leader's opportunity to get to know their people on a personal level so that they can be most efficient and supportive in meeting those needs for power, progress, and purpose. Again, a great question there. Do we have time for one more?
Yep, let's do one more.
All right. So just because people have ideas, should they always be given the power to act on those ideas? Or when is it appropriate to not let them act on those ideas? All right, so that is a great question as well. And clearly, giving people full reign over their roles is not only not realistic, it's not going to be productive for anybody. We really want to make sure that, A, there's alignment in the goals and the achievables that we're aspiring to, and that there's alignment between everybody on the team. But more importantly, just as it would not be appropriate to give the steering wheel of a car to a 5-year-old, not because of any character flaw on their part, but simply because they don't have the skills to drive yet. We wouldn't want to hand over the reins of a role to our employees either if they don't have the skills they need in order to be successful. So that's a great question, and that whole issue of handing over power comes with the qualification that we really want to make sure folks are qualified to be able to use that power responsibly before we simply hand it over to them. But 9 times out of 10, especially if we've put these other parameters in place, we will have a sense for just how competent our employees are. In fact, we may have a better sense of their competency than they do, and we may even have to force them to take some ownership for their ideas, which again poses more opportunities to increase engagement.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you everyone for attending today. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@talentquest.com, and we will be sending all of you, as well as registrants who were unable to attend, a recording of today's webinar. And please look towards our next webinar, and we hope to see you next month. Thanks again. Bye.